You're listening to Who Were the Comedian Harmonists, the true story behind Broadway's Harmony. I'm your host, Ruthie Fierberg. If Harry Fromerman is the reason the comedian harmonists existed, then Erich Collin is the reason they became world famous. Erich spoke multiple languages fluently and was able to correspond with concert agents outside of Germany to expand the group's reach. He was also the singer that completed their sound. Up until Erich joined, the group, even with its revolving door of members, had only been a quintet, 4 singers and a pianist. Erich rounded out the sound and created the sextet that became recognized as the comedian harmonists.
By all accounts, was kind of the glue of a lot of the vocal harmony. So he was the sort of second tenor role, which when you listen to the recordings is often kind of difficult to pick out. He's a lot of sort of the fabric of some of the harmony.
That's Eric Peters, the actor who played Erich Collin in Harmony. While Collin blended into the comedian harmonists, his story is actually one that sticks out, as our resident historian, Jan Grübler, details.
Erich Abraham Collin was the last singer to join the famous 6 of the comedian harmonists. He was born August 26th, 1899 in Berlin. His father was a pediatrician, Dr. Paul Abraham. His mother, Elsbeth Collin, was the daughter of a bookseller and a publisher. So the son of a doctor and a woman from a publishing house. What kind of family was Erich born into?
Well, I would say that that was a very welcoming family. His father was very important that time in Berlin. He was the member of several scientific organizations, and he owned how is that in English, an orphanage, a home for sick children outside of Berlin.
Yes.
And he put them there for 4 weeks so they can breathe the fresh air in the landscape. And seems to be a very interesting man. Unfortunately, his parents divorced in about 1906, and that's the reason why Erich Collin and also his 2 older sisters, they used the maiden name of the mother, and so he called sometimes Erich Collin or Erich Abraham Collin or only Erich Abraham. That changes from time to time.
And did he live exclusively with his mother, only with his mother, or did he also spend time with his father as a child once his parents were divorced?
They always spent time with his father. For instance, in that home for sick children, he went there in the school holidays together with his sister and spent time there with his father. But the most time he lived with his mother and his 2 sisters. But finally, he was the last one who lived with the mother because the elder sisters got their own flats and their own jobs and left the mother.
How many years between Erich and his sisters?
There are about 2 or 4 years to the other 2 sisters. And the older sister married a doctor too and went to Switzerland. And the other sister became a teacher and lived in Berlin too.
So Charlotte married a doctor and Anne-Marie stayed behind.
That's right.
Were they a musical family, a scientific family? What was life like around the house?
I think they were more a scientific family because of the profession of the father. But they also made music, and his father played the violin, and also Erich, as a child, became some education in playing violin. And it's said that his father was a friend of Albert Einstein, and Einstein visited them in their home, and they played together. It's said that one time Erich himself said that he played together with Albert Einstein and his father on the violin.
Wow.
And Erich had the same problem like Fromerman, because his father didn't like any cultural jobs, and he wanted to that his son will be a doctor too. He will become a doctor too. And so Erich first studied for a certain time medicine, but then he broke up that studies and switched to studying music, singing and playing violin in Berlin at the music school or high school in Berlin.
How was he able to get out of the study of medicine and go to study music?
I think that wasn't a big problem, but that was also after his father died. And so he was free to make his own decisions. And then he decided, no, I want to become a musician. He liked it more than to be a doctor.
My understanding is that when he was about 25, he began at the School for Music in Berlin, and that's where he met Erwin Boetz.
Yeah, that was the way how he came in contact with the comedian Harmonists, because they were searching for a new second tenor. They had some trouble with the former one, and they wanted to replace him. And so he went there for an audition, and they said, oh, that's a very, very fine voice he had. And it was perfect to mix it with the voice of Ari Leshnikov, the first tenor.
Harmony actually showcases this storyline about Erich, about his parents wanting him to become a doctor and how he attended medical school. But the musical suggests that Erich joined the comedian Harmonists in secret while still studying medicine, and that he would have to break the news to his high society parents when their well-to-do friends saw Erich perform on stage.
I know you will find it ironical, a smear on the family chronicle. Oh, Daddy, hold on to your monocle. Your son is becoming a singer.
In fact, after serving in the German army at the end of the First World War, Erich studied medicine for 7 semesters before quitting and telling his father he wanted to be a musician. His father still disapproved, so Erich worked as an apprentice at a bank for a year. He was still living with his mother and younger sister, Anne-Marie. It was only when his father passed away that Erich enrolled in the Hochschule for Music. By the time his classmate Erwin Boetz asked Erich to audition and then join the comedian Harmonists, Erich was fully committed to music. And as Eric Peters mentioned, Erich Collin gelled the group musically.
He has a lot of what I like to call the operative harmony, which is, or the sort of operative lines within the music, where you're singing the sort of notes that are a little crunchier, a little more difficult, a little less, the more complicated vocal lines that really sort of bring out the harmony, and less of, oftentimes on the recordings, you can really hear the high T1 and you can really hear a lot of the bass stuff and then whoever's soloing. And he was a little bit less of that and a little more of the kind of the meat and potatoes.
What else was Erich able to bring to the group, both musically and then on the business side?
Erich was very educated, and he was able to speak several languages, and that was very helpful in the upcoming of the comedian Harmonists, because he could talk to the concert agents from abroad and to write letters to them to make the conversation in organizing contracts. That was his part.
What is your understanding of the kind of person that Erich was, coming to the group a little late, but being a match, both musically and personality-wise?
Well, Erich was a very silent person, or a quiet person. He wasn't such a joke maker like Collin, and he wasn't so loud like Biberti. He was a very kind and friendly person. And so he was very good fitting in that group, because they tried to make not one of the 6 members the superstar of the group, so they all have been equal. And he was very good fitting in that team.
But perhaps the best person to tell us what Erich was like is someone who knew him.
I was pretty much raised by my mother and my grandparents up until the age of 5. After that, from 5 till about 9.5, I was with my mother and stepfather, who is Debbie's father, and my grandfather Erich, who was the second tenor of the comedian Harmonists, died in 1961 when I was about 9.5. So I have recollection of him in the home until I was about 5, and then after that, my relationship was with my grandfather.
Erich's grandson, Marc Alexander, shares his memories.
If someone were to ask you to paint a picture with words of your grandfather, how do you describe him?
I would describe him as a very kind, thoughtful person. His temperament was very even-keeled, as I remember it. And I have vignettes of him singing in the shower and shaving with a straight razor and fishing with me at Malibu. And he liked the outdoors. He liked to listen to music, and he enjoyed doing things with his family and friends. He liked to go to the beach. He liked to picnic. He liked to go occasionally to the mountains, and he liked to fish. That was a very enjoyable activity that I remember. So I knew him first as a grandfather, not as a member of the comedian Harmonists. That came later.
His fellow comedian Harmonists called him a gentleman through and through, honest and well-educated. Erich was also one of the few family men of the comedian Harmonists. Only he, Leshnikov, and Boats ever had children. But Erich stands out because he married and became a father as the group was peaking. Leshnikov and Boats' children wouldn't come until 1938 and 1944, respectively. In Erich's case, he met Fernande Holzamer in 1930. Fernande was the daughter of a French tailor and an Irish homemaker. Erich and Fernande married in 1931. There are a few versions of their meet-cute, according to Erich and Fernande's granddaughter, Deborah Tint, who happens to be Marc's half-sister.
That is a story that came to me through Nana, and I call my grandmother Nana, so that will kind of come out every once in a while.
Give it to us. We want the real. We want the authentic.
And I got it in a couple of different versions, so I'll give you what I think is a kind of a reasonable amalgam of all of those, and that is that she had gone to a nightclub, and she was very careful to say it was classy, it was a dignified nightclub. And she met Erich and they danced, and he invited her to see him in concert like the following night or sometime that week. So she arranged to have a friend take her to the performance. And apparently her friend was completely unimpressed with the comedian Harmonists and wanted to leave early.
So no taste.
And so he took her home. She said goodbye to him. He left. She turned right around. She got in a cab. She went back to the performance. And that's when they really met. And I guess maybe afterwards they went to a nightclub and then they exchanged contact information. So he, of course, was on tour. So he left town and he wrote her a letter. And the letter was addressed to Fernande Holzamer, which was not her last name. Her last name was Holzamer. And she was deeply offended that he had gotten the name wrong.
So much for being the head of correspondence.
I guess he learned his lesson later on. And so she didn't write him back. She said, well, performers, they have a reputation.
Mm.
And so he wrote her a couple other letters. And at that point, he got the name right. I think he realized he'd made a mistake. And then when he came back around to Frankfurt, which is where she was living, they met up again. And they were married shortly after that.
Where were they married?
They were married in Frankfurt, as far as I know, because that's where she was living and that's where her family was.
Was she living with her family at the time? Was she working? Was she studying?
I believe she was living with her family, and she was apprenticed to a dressmaker, and she was very interested in fashion design. And that's what she was doing. And I think her sister was a hat maker.
Oh, wow.
And her parents were tailors. So it was really the family was all involved in clothing.
And when they got married, did she continue to apprentice and work in that field, or did she start to travel with him? How long distance were they? Do you know? As
far as I know, she didn't continue to work after they got married. I don't know for sure, but I didn't hear anything about that dynamic of her working while they were married. And she did go on tour with them at least some of the time. She was in a lot of these different places. And we have photographs of her in Italy and on shipboard. And Erich was a great shutterbug. A lot of the family photos come from him.
Fernande traveled with the group until their daughter Suzanne, Marc and Deborah's mother, was born in 1932.
The first time, Fernande accompanied her husband to the concert tours, and she also was in Australia, for instance. But then their daughter Susan was born, and so she decided to stay at home. So when Susan was growing up, she had to go to school, for instance, and so Fernande stayed in Berlin.
The Collins settled into a nice life as the comedian harmonist's success continued to grow. That is, until the race laws were enacted in Germany. Though Erich had been baptized, raised as a Christian, and fully identified as a Christian, both of his parents had been born Jewish. And therefore, so had he.
Erich didn't really identify with his Jewish heritage until the rise of the Nazi powers, correct?
That's correct. So his parents were Jewish. He didn't have a Jewish life with all the traditions, and he didn't went to the synagogue, and he didn't live all the Jewish traditions. And he was baptized, like many Jews in Germany were, and he took part, at least for the last few weeks, in World War I as a soldier. And he was proud to be German, and it wasn't important for him to have Jewish roots. But later, he had to learn from the Nazi laws that they considered him to be a full Jew, with all the consequences that had for him.
I think what crystallized that was the letter from the
RMK.
Yeah, the Reichsmusikkammer in 1934, I believe, which was addressed to Robert Berberti, who was being treated then as the spokesperson for the comedian harmonists. Berberti was not Jewish, and the letter said, it's come to our attention that you have 3 non-Aryan members of your group, and if you want to continue, you're going to have to sing more folkish tunes, and you're going to have to get rid of the Jewish members of your group. And the Jewish members of the group got together and they kind of scratched their head and said, wait, I thought we only had 2 Jewish members. And then Erich said, well, I'm Jewish, I guess, under the race laws, and I'm with you. And that's that act by the Reichsmusikkammer, which caused Erich to lose his job as a musician in Germany, is, I think, what also crystallized the fact that he was going to be treated as Jewish in the eyes of the world, so he may as well accept it and deal with it.
Along with Harry and Roman, Erich fled Germany with Fernande and Suzanne.
1935, when the group disbanded, that she also stayed with her husband, and they together with their daughter then went to Vienna.
There, in Vienna, it is said that Erich led the charge to recreate the group now called the Comedy Harmonists.
Does it surprise you at all that Erich was the one who had the motivation to establish the Vienna group? That it wasn't Harry, that it was Erich who said, let's, the 3 of us, find more singers and let's do this our way?
I don't know exactly if that was only Erich's idea. I think they decided that together. But
okay.
Luckily, Erich was willing to proceed the group and to go to Vienna, because he knew that as the Nazis considered him to be a Jew, that he had no future in Germany and he had to go abroad. And that was the best thing he could do, to join the new group and to stay as a second tenor, and so to proceed the success and also to earn money that time.
At first, Fernande and Suzanne accompanied Erich on tour.
At the end of the 30s, the reconstituted group, the Comedy Harmonists, visited Australia, and we have photographs of my grandmother in an Australian newspaper after being interviewed, and photographs of the group, and even a cartoon about the Comedy Harmonists that appeared in an Australian newspaper. So, yes, our grandparents did do things together. They did travel together.
But when the daughter, Susan, became older, then Fernande decided we will stay at the place. And after 1938, they moved to France because she was speaking French and she had relatives there. And so she decided to settle with her relatives in France and to bring her daughter in a French school there. And they also had the idea to settle in Australia and to become Australian citizens, but the war destroyed all the plans, and then Erich set in America, and he wasn't able to return to Europe, and his wife wasn't able to leave France. And after France was occupied in 1941, it was absolutely impossible for her to escape.
They were split apart from like 1940 to 1947.
At first, Erich continued to tour with the Vienna group. Let's rewind a little bit. The Vienna group had rehearsed during the summer of 1935 and made their first appearance as the Comedy Harmonists in August of that year. They toured the world in 1936 and 1937. In 1938, their tour in Italy was interrupted by anti-Semitic laws, but they still made it to England and performed at the London Coliseum. In 1939, they embarked on their second Australian tour, and in 1940, they made it to Hawaii, but it didn't last. In 1941, Roman Sikowski decided to leave the group, which led to its dissolution.
What happens when that Comedy Harmonists group disbands? Where does Erich go next?
Well, that was in early 1941 when all the attempts to precede the group failed, and they decided to dissolve. And then he went to Los Angeles and he did different jobs. He was a bookseller and a seller for kitchen furniture and other things, because he also wasn't able to proceed his musical career as a German-speaking person. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't an educated medical doctor, so he couldn't work in that field. And later he specialized in special method in producing fiberglass products. He learned that like a new profession.
Manufacturing.
Yeah, and then later he entered a big corporation in California who built airplanes. And there he especially was responsible for those matters, producing pieces of fiberglass or plastic glass.
What brought him to Los Angeles in the first place? Why did he pick there?
I'm not sure why he didn't stay in New York like Harry. Maybe it was accidentally, or he had some friends or relatives. I'm not sure. He had some support by Albert Einstein because he knew that Einstein is in America too, and he was a friend of his father. So he asked him for some support, and Einstein wrote a letter that Erich could use to apply for a new job. And maybe that way he came to California.
And it seems strange to me, though, that he wouldn't try to go to France as opposed to the United States if that's where his wife and his daughter were. Why wouldn't he go to France?
Well, I think, first of all, it was a problem of money, of the lack of money. And maybe that also Collin had some fear to go back to Europe. As far as I know, Collin was the only one who never returned to Germany, for instance. And maybe he wanted to stay in America because he thought that there the opportunities to live are better. And he always had the idea to form a new group and tried it in America too. And so then they decided, when he got some support of his boss, he gave him some money, and then decided that Fernande and his daughter will come to him to California. I think it was in 1947.
When my mother was 14 years old and the war was over, and she hadn't seen her father since she was a little girl and didn't really have a memory of him. And the story in the family is that my grandmother said to her, "Well, I have something to tell you." And my mother said, "Well, what's that?" And she said, "Your father is alive." And supposedly my mother said, "Well, yeah, and the next thing you're going to tell me is that his name is Abraham." And my grandmother said, "Well, actually it is."
What do you know about why he chose to go to the United States, why he settled? I know that there were many stops on the tours of the Jewish group, the Comedy Harmonists, all over the world, like you said, Australia, South America, Europe, and including the US. Do you have a sense of why that's where he ended up settling?
I don't know the answer to that. I would speculate because he was the first member on my mother's side of the family to settle in the United States. I think what it amounted to was that he got legal permission to travel to the United States, and he arrived here around 1940. First, he was in New York. He taught for a short while at NYU. He then found a bunch of other jobs that allowed him to sustain himself. And he then worked to bring his wife and his daughter to the United States. And they eventually arrived in 1947 and they moved to California. And in California, Erich had some connections because I think relative of Roman Tchaikovsky lived already in Southern California and had a liquor store where Erich was able to work for a short while. So I think he ended up in the United States for reasons of expedience because he somehow he was able to do that. He got permission to travel to the United States, and once here, he worked toward achieving citizenship, which he eventually got some years later.
And those friendships clearly held strong from the group. If one of the reasons for California was a bond to Roman and the connections that Roman could provide to Erich.
That's right. And those connections persisted.
In fact, as Erich got his footing in the States, he wanted to reestablish the Comedy Harmonists as an American group.
It became more and more better, his living conditions. But besides, he always had the dream to build a new group in the style of the Comedian Harmonists, maybe with some modern repertoire of the then 1950s. And he tried to engage Frommermann and Zitzowski and other members of the Comedy Harmonists to join this group, but all they denied because they meanwhile had their own jobs, and they didn't want to get, again, that risk to have rehearsals for months without payment, always the same problem. And so he started with American singers only. That was first in late 1947 or 1948 when he had the first concert tour through Europe and when Frommermann joined the group. And he did it again in the middle of the 1950s, but that attempt failed completely. He never could rebuild the group.
One of the things that surprised me in learning the history about Erich is that while Harry was the founder of the original group, it seems that Erich was the most persistent once they left Germany about continuing to sing, continuing to have a group, whether it was that Vienna group, the Comedy Harmonists, in many different iterations, keeping them touring, then creating an American group of an American Comedian Harmonists. Tell me, did that musicality seem to stay present for you? Are you surprised that he was so adamant to keep it going?
I'm not, because he told my mother, Debbie's mother, and my mother, don't feel sorry for me because I lived a lifetime in 7 years, which I think included his time with the Comedian Harmonists and his few years with the Comedy Harmonists. And I think quite simply, he was a musical person, and this had been the best part of his life, and he hoped to somehow recreate that after his life had been totally turned upside down. So I'm not that surprised, although, perhaps his plans were not realistic, but I think I understand the emotional motivation.
Erich was so involved in the tour planning and the business side and the contracts for the Comedian Harmonists. And so I could see why, if one of the members who wanted to sing and then was kind of left stranded, but didn't have those skills, might think, well, what am I going to do about this? Erich knew how the nuts and bolts worked, and he was used to doing it. So it makes a certain amount of sense that he would have been maybe more comfortable than some of them, and also more able than some of them to actually pull that stuff off.
There were repeated attempts to sort of kind of get this group back up and going again. And at a certain point, with all the distance we have from it, you would think, well, perhaps, there comes a point when you would want to move on and do something else. But there's another part of me that finds it really beautiful and also quite tragic and sad, because it's very clear this is what he loved to do. Right. And especially coming from a place of, perhaps I'm going to be a doctor. My parents want me to do this, or maybe I'll go into banking or whatever it is. And then finding that thing that you love, and when it is so tragically ripped away from you. Right. I think there's something sad yet beautiful about sort of reading all the history of, he loved this and he really, really wanted to do it.
Professionally, it seems that Erich did well enough. He neither catapulted to fame in America nor became wealthy in business. But he didn't seem to struggle as some of his fellow comedian harmonists did. In 1955, he got a steady job at Northrop, an aircraft manufacturer. And in terms of family, Erich did get to witness the birth of both of his grandchildren, Marc and Deborah. Sadly, Erich died unexpectedly during surgery on April 28, 1961, at the age of 61.
Yes, he had to go to a surgery in the hospital because of an inflammation of the appendix. So he was the first one of the former members of the Comedian Harmonists who died.
Didn't have the fortune to actually know my grandfather because I was very young when he died. But so I knew him more through things and feelings that kind of circulated in the family about him. I think actually the nicest kind of encapsulation of Erich's personality is from a quote that I have from my mother. And she was reacting to something that Leshnikov said in the documentary. He kind of minimized Erich and said that he was a pretty boy. And she said, and I'm going to quote her, "I, of course, did not remember my father when he was young and a pretty boy, as Leshnikov says, but dumb he never was. My father is the person with whom I had interminable conversations when I was a teenager about music, religion, philosophy, and politics. He gave me the pleasure in those realities and the habit of good conversation." And this is something that continued through our family. This is something that I remember from my growing up, that sitting around the table, having a long conversation about wide-ranging subjects was just part of the family fabric. And I think that came through from my grandparents.
Both he and my grandmother, whose lives had been totally disrupted by the Second World War, didn't talk about the past. They were fortunate people to have survived. They were forward-looking. I think they'd been traumatized, and
of course,
they wanted their grandchild and their daughter to Americanize.
What do you hope that people remember most about Erich?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, his voice. In some of the songs, you can hear when Erich Collin is singing. If you know the different voices, then you hear him singing the German phrases. And then it's his appearance, because he was a very gentle guy, and he was wearing a monocle from time to time, and a very educated person. But if you know all the stories in the background, then for me, he is very important because he was always trying to keep living the idea of the Comedian Harmonists, to rebuild the groups as ever it was possible. Even if it was not successful, but he never gave up.
I think of an intelligent man, a good conversationalist, a worldly man, spoke several languages, and an artist. It was someone, he studied art, he studied violin, he studied voice, someone who was passionate about music and performance and bringing that gift to the world. One thing talking with Deborah and Marc that they mentioned is he wasn't necessarily bitter about how everything turned out. Obviously sad, and there was so much to go from being incredibly famous and incredibly rich to all moving to the United States, having to move across the entire globe, restarting your whole life, being separated from your family, working several different jobs just to kind of get by. it's amazing to me, his sort of resilience. At the end of it, he was grateful. And I believe Deborah told me this quote that he said, "I lived an entire life in 7 years."
Who Were the Comedian Harmonists? The True Story Behind Broadway's Harmony is produced by Harmony, a New Musical, and Broadway News, the home for digital journalism on Broadway. I'm your host, Ruthie Fierberg. Thank you so much for listening. To read more about the Comedian Harmonists, visit thecomedianharmonists.com. For more information about the musical Harmony, visit harmonyanewmusical.com. And of course, to learn more about all of the happenings on Broadway, visit broadwaynews.com. If you're fascinated by what you've heard so far on this podcast, please share the Comedian Harmonists story on social media and tag @Harmony, a New Musical and @Broadway News.